You can start now.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the WTO Trade Dialogues on Food, entitled Shipping Food Across Borders, Navigating the Choke Points. I'd like to welcome our panelists and you, the viewer. My name is Lorian LaRocco, and I'm the Senior Editor of Guests and Global Supply Chain Reporter at CNBC. I'm also a columnist for FreightWaves as well as book author. I'll be moderating today's debate and we'll be putting 2 rounds of questions to our panelists, after which I'll be opening the floor to questions from you, the viewers. Viewers can send questions to dialogues@WTO.org. There is a phrase I created that people who may follow me may have heard or read, and that's containers don't lie. It's a simple thesis that debunks rhetoric we hear in both the political and logistical worlds. These boxes filled with goods are physical evidence of what is moving on the ocean highway. Trade is the beacon of truth and can dispel bluster. By using trade data, I've been able to show that tariffs between countries simply alter the flow of trade and do not improve trade relations. Countries that have engaged in trade war have simply seen trade be redirected as an outcome of their policies. This often results in ocean travel becoming longer and more costly. Ultimately, this impacts food prices, with high food prices being a major concern since the COVID pandemic. Today, the world of trade is circumventing numerous fronts of uncertainty: the Red Sea diversions, the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine, environmental challenges at the Panama Canal, and labor strife that has both diverted and grounded trade to a halt. But what we have all learned through the years is that trade is resilient and will always find a way to flow. But the slower pace of trade does have impacts from both a time perspective and cost. Today, the new normal is, well, uncertainty. That uncertainty has ripple effects throughout the supply chain. Here to offer their insights into how we as a world navigate these uncertainties to ensure the delivery of food is a panel of very distinguished experts. Let me, without further ado, introduce them to you. First, Ben Parker, Officer in charge of the UN Black Sea Initiative Support Office. Ileana Achiotatis, Secretary General of COSRL. Dua Abdel Motal, Senior Counselor for World Trade Organization. Sylvia Di Mariucci, Maritime Business Strategic Advisor and Vice President of Operations for the Panama Canal Authority, and Jan Hoffman, Head of Trade Logistics Branch on the Technology and Logistics for the UN Trade and Development. Hello, everybody. So let's get right to it. Let's kick this off with the WTO's outlook on international trade. How would you characterize this year in terms of food security compared to last year, and just how fragile is the world's security at this time?
Thank you very much, Lorianne. First, for agreeing to moderate this webinar. We're thrilled to have you with us, but also for this very important topic that we're tackling today. And I really look forward to hearing from the other panelists. I think this year we are definitely in a better spot than we were last year. Having said that, there is no room for complacency. We're in a better spot in terms of world food prices that have come down significantly. We're in a better spot in terms of greater availability, fewer bottlenecks relative to previous periods that we've seen. International agricultural trade has had to weather a series of shocks in recent years, whether the COVID pandemic or wars. Now, what we've seen is that world food and agricultural trade is one of the most resilient sectors of world trade. And so it has demonstrated its resiliency. And what we have also seen is that the WTO is capable of reining in some of the worst kinds of instincts of policymakers in times of crises. So first, on resilience, let me just say that during the COVID-19 pandemic, agricultural trade fell by approximately 5 to 10% at the aggregate sectorial level, an impact that was 2 to 3 times less than the magnitude of the reduction in non-agricultural trade. So that's a sign of how resilient it is. Also, 2 years down the line now from the Russia-Ukraine war, and while the war continues to disrupt agricultural value chains, global commodity markets have adjusted to the war, and we've seen increased exports by other suppliers. Now, why this resiliency? What are the reasons? First is the inelasticity of demand for food. Consumers always want food. Whether there's war in the background, a pandemic in the background, there's always demand for food. Second is that global supply chains are now strong and well established, and they make it easy to switch suppliers. Not terribly easy, but it is still possible today, and much more so than before, to switch suppliers and to switch to equivalent products. In fact, food and agricultural trade has been steadily growing in all regions of the world and has increased fivefold since the turn of the century. In terms of worst instincts and the WTO reining them in, now, when there's a problem at the international level, governments typically react by protecting their food supply. The instinct is to hoard food at the national level. The instinct is to stop exporting your food and to keep your food for yourself. We in the WTO have tried to fight those instincts because we want international trade to continue to be reliable. In fact, we've seen the outcome of these policies during the 2008 food price crisis, where one food export restriction led to another, and global rice prices, for instance, spiraled. And we've seen this in the wake of the Ukraine war, with a wave of export restrictions, mostly concentrated on wheat. Now, due to the achievements of the WTO at its 12th ministerial conference, several decisions were taken urging countries to facilitate trade, to use export restrictions only when necessary, food export restrictions, and in particular, not to restrict the export of food to the World Food Programme, which absolutely needs to access food to fulfill its humanitarian mission. We've seen as a result of that, the situation stabilize. Food export restrictions have come down. There are now 18 measures that remain in place, export restrictions on food, feed, and fertilizer. But this is certainly a smaller number than before, and they are less concentrated on staples. We have also heard from the World Food Programme that the decision by the WTO to urge members to not restrict the sale of food to the World Food Programme has worked, and they are now able to source food from over 100 countries compared to only 90 in 2020. But as I said, Lauriane, there's no room for complacency. While the FAO Food Price Index is 2% lower than this same time last year and 25% lower than March 2022 at its peak at the start of the war, progress is uneven. There are pockets of hunger across the globe, and high food prices remain in certain countries due to a mix of exchange rate policies, economic policies, conflicts, and so on. So we must continue to be very disciplined with trade policy.
Most definitely. Thank you so much, Dua. Ben, let's turn to you. We've hit on, of course, the protectionist trade policies and the ramifications and how detrimental it is to food security. What update can you offer us on the Black Sea Grain Initiative? And do you think the world can expect it to be renewed? And I'll have a follow-up after.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the opportunity to be here today with such an interesting topic and a great panel. The Black Sea Grain Initiative is over, in one sense, because one of the parties, the Russian Federation, decided to detach itself after a year of operation. But during that year, it did achieve its goals, which was to unblock the food in storage in Ukraine from earlier harvests. It allowed Ukrainian farmers to have the confidence to plant again for a future season. It contributed to bringing down international prices for wheat and other key food commodities, calming the markets, and it provided a safe mechanism for shippers and sailors to do their work. So in that sense, it succeeded in its goals. 32 million tons was exported during the year. If you had to, you could argue that's enough food for 160 million people. So after the Russian Federation pulled out in July, there was a pause. Ukraine was again unable to export from its deep sea ports, although it did have a plan B, which was to export through the ports on the Danube. So its exports were never completely switched on and off, but those ports couldn't handle the volumes by any means that the ports, the deep sea Odessa ports could. If there's a successor, I think the goal, if a successor agreement, the goal of that would be predictable, sustainable, and safe transport of agricultural exports, both from Ukraine and from the Russian Federation, because together they represent a huge chunk of wheat, corn, and sunflower oil in the market. And the talks that have been going on since the end of the formal Black Sea Grain Initiative have focused on this concept of a safe navigation package deal, where both sides could feel more confident that their ports and their ships calling at their ports wouldn't be interfered with. And this would allow also some predictability and planning for the farmers. It would result in reduced transaction costs and insurance premiums. It would make the seafarers and the sailors safer. And it would also, reduce one of the choke points that are affecting both sides. So just a final point on that, I think we think of choke points perhaps as geographical, narrow passages through the world's oceans. But in fact, Russia would argue that it's facing a political choke point, that the imposition of Western sanctions, while they do not sanction food and fertilizer, their ability to transact in the banking system, to insure, to move in and out of different ports, and to engage for their ship registries, to engage. That is a choke point that's affecting Russian exports. So Russian traders have argued that they have a choke point from the sanctions, they have a choke point from insecurity in the Black Sea, then they have a choke point in the Suez Canal, then they have a choke point in the Red Sea, and so they have a daisy chain of choke points. Ukraine, of course, would argue that they have a security choke point followed by all the same list. So the Black Sea Grain Initiative was a humanitarian success, but not by doing traditional humanitarian aid or distribution of food. It was actually a market intervention, a trade action, which delivered socioeconomic benefits by reducing the price contributing to the reducing of the prices by about 20% from the peak after the Russian invasion. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, most recently, the data came out where Russia has historic highs of grain coming out of the region, and Ukraine, has seen a bump up. So most definitely in terms of looking at the success point in terms of getting the grain out to those that are in need. Where do you see the stumbling blocks in Black Sea Grain Part 2? And are the negotiators seeing any bright spots in these talks as you guys try to carve out like a second initiative?
So, I mean, ironically, one of the stumbling blocks is that both sides are doing okay. Since the end of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, the balance of power at sea has changed. It's not my place to discuss military matters, but Ukraine has asserted itself in the Western Black Sea and has been able to give some plausible guarantees of safety to cargo ships. So they are now exporting at a rate even higher than during the Black Sea Grain Initiative. So in one sense, they don't feel the need of a new agreement. Where they feel the need is two areas. One, safety at port, because strikes attributed to Russia are harming infrastructure in the ports. Russia would argue that's military targets. Ukraine would argue that there's often civilian infrastructure. And the second area where they're hurting is on the additional costs related to war risk insurance. So the farmers are less competitive because the ships are charging more to carry the same ton of grain. than they are charging their competitors, including Russia. So the space for a new agreement has to take into account the changing balance of power in a military sense. And that means Russia now feels threatened by Ukraine for its port facilities. Then maybe both sides could consider a kind of mutual agreement of restraint. And the Secretary General of the UN proposed in February something along those lines. And the Republic of Turkey had quiet negotiations with both parties in March that nearly got there. It would have been a deal for safe navigation and to leave each other alone, as it were.
Well, hopefully, in the future, we'll have a positive outcome. Let's turn to food safety as it relates to these longer ocean transits. Ileana, as Ben pointed out, with all of these choke points and with what's going on within the Red Sea, travel time is taking longer. How is that affecting food safety, and how do we make sure that food safety does not become a collateral cost as a result of these blockages? Oh, Ileana, you're on mute. Just click on the three dots. There
I'm
you
back.
go.
I'm back. Yeah, I was blocked. Yeah. So I want to just to put the context, because I mean, and it was interesting that Ben started and launched the conversation, because in the last 2 years we've seen the invasion of Ukraine. We then had, so this was February 2022. A year later, we had the Panama Canal and the drought of the Panama Canal. And then at the end of 2023, we had the Houthis attacks in the Red Sea, which blocked access to the Suez Canal. And I think it's interesting to look at, I mean, the challenge has been huge. And yet, I would say there's no risk to food security. There were high fears, real fears. Everyone worried. The timing of the Black Sea Grain Initiative was great, because if you look at what it took in terms of negotiations, etc., it came very quickly on. So I think it was July 2022, if I remember well. It came just on time for the harvest, which was also a good thing, and it created a sense of stability and reassurance. We had a lot of other challenges. Insurance was mentioned. For a long time, insurance wasn't an issue, etc. And at the same time, so it gave also the possibility to develop what were called the solidarity lanes, which really were looking at other possibilities to reroute trade over land. And this was put together between Ukraine and the EU. And I think the challenges were there, but the fact that the market saw very quickly that solutions were being taken care of. I mean, we had that big political negotiation on the one hand, and then traders were finding solutions. Prices peaked in May 2022, but then they started following down. And that created a sense of, I think, stability and reassurance, which benefited also the market when the other challenges came up. And I mean, the Panama Canal, Sylvia will explain this much better than I would, but it was, one came after the other, and we didn't see the same kind of peaks. And today, in reality, prices, and Doha mentioned that prices have come down. So longer routes, yes, because if you cannot use the canals, you have to go down, from the Cape of Good Hope, etc. But the longer routes are not significant enough to create tensions with regard to food security. And maybe we should talk here about food availability. And again, going back to Doha, you made a comment about there are other issues. So this is from a trading perspective, we're making food available, and then food security, there are other drivers that can influence that. So I'd say it's rather positive. One thing, though, a challenge that I would like to put on the table is that, and Ben talked about the political choke points. And what I think we could see, and I thought it was very interesting, it was a study by the Bank of International Settlement that came out a few days ago, where they looked at 32 countries and the evolution between 2017 and 2023, where they looked at geopolitical allegiances and how these impact trade. And I thought it was very interesting to see that between 2017 and 2023, the increase of trade was 2.5% lower between countries that are not friends. And this is something that we need to keep an eye on going forward, and to watch voting in the UN. I think this would be this could be a choke point, a real one, going forward. Thank you.
Very insightful. Sylvia, let's turn to you. We all know about, the headlines that have come out of the Panama Canal as a result of Mother Nature and the drought. Can you give us an update, if you will, on the strengthening of the infrastructure of the canal and how long that's going to take? And with the pace of climate change, are the improvements lasting, or are they just a Band-Aid?
Well, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to address you and to share with you our kind of roller coaster year we had with the El Niño. We are operating in an era of extreme climate risk. Panama ranks 4 in the list of countries with the greatest rainfall per year in the world, and our main challenge in terms of sustainability is to manage rain, both when it's scarce and when it's abundant, when it causes flooding. 2023 El Niño ranked all the alerts for us and pushed us to implement extreme measures, such as the restriction of transits down from regular 36 to 38 down to 24. And we had to reduce our draft from 50 feet to 44. And in addition, we had to implement a number of measures to improve our performance and save water. The Panama Canal Authority is responsible for the management, maintenance, use, and conservation of water resources of the canal watershed. The canal watershed is one of the 52 hydrographic watersheds in the country. In 2006, a law reduced the size of this watershed, leaving the number of large rivers outside of the jurisdiction of the Panama Canal Authority. This year, this law was declared unconstitutional and reversed. This means that the area grew from 343,000 hectares to about 552,000 hectares, with a population of 324,000+ people. This change enables the Canal Authority to proceed with water project solutions that were identified in different studies carried out. The project identified by the Panama Canal as the most viable to meet the needs of the population and ship transits operations, because we have to ensure fresh water for the population of the cities of Panama and Colón, is the construction of a new multi-purpose reservoir in the Rio Indio area. This project is probably going to take about 6 years to be completed, including all the environmental mitigations, the social programs that need to be implemented to move people and relocate people. And in addition to the construction, we also need some time for the filling up of this reservoir. So we need to wait for the rain to fill it up in order to be able to use it. This is probably the project that yields the best cost-benefit ratio and will ensure enough water for the population and transiting vessels for at least the next 50 years. It is important to mention that all of our efforts are not focused only on water projects, but they also contemplate an integrated vision of climate resilience development that includes reducing the Panama Canal Authority's own operational emissions, a plan to work with the entire maritime value chain to incentivize emission reductions as well, and take meaningful actions to ensure collective success in the new climate economy. As an integrated effort, we promote that the socioeconomic and environmental development of the communities in the watershed is sustainable and financially inclusive. With programs for sustainable agriculture, we have a nice program for enforcing the harvesting of crops that are useful to avoid erosion in the area. And right now we have a very good yield of coffee, for example, in the area, and farmers are really receiving the benefits of this harvest. In addition, it is important to mention that the land in the watershed is not owned by the Panama Canal. It's owned by private citizens, and most of them are farmers. So therefore, we also support light titling, which contributes to improving the quality of life of the communities in the watershed, ensuring water production and the protection of the forest and the area in general.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sylvia, for that. Jan, let's talk about the headwinds. We've all talked about them, right? Suez, Panama Canal, the war between Russia, Ukraine, what's going on in the Red Sea. What are the main logistical challenges you see for food trade at this time, and how can we navigate those choke points?
Right, yeah, fascinating. And I hope I'm not going to become too technical here, but to complement what Sylvia just said, and congratulations, actually, the first time in modern history, for at least the data we have, the last couple of weeks, there were more transits through the Panama Canal than through the Suez Canal in terms of number of ships, because the Panama Canal is recovering through the measures Sylvia described and rain coming back, while sadly, unfortunately, the situation in the Red Sea continues. If not, it's getting worse. So I was just this morning, just for you, checking the latest numbers. So the latest available week, last week, there were on average 32 daily transits through the Panama Canal, and Sylvia would correct me if I was wrong, but I think these are the correct figures, vis-a-vis only 29 transits per day through Suez. And here, maybe for the listeners, one difference I see between the two canals. Panama is normally working at full capacity. Yeah, there's no volatility due to a change in demand. If demand changes, you increase the price. Yeah, Sylvia increases the price. All ships go around South Africa, or they go through Suez to the East Coast, or they take the land bridge. They go by ship to Los Angeles, and then take the train. That's for only containers. So while Suez is much more volatile also on the demand side, and the decline right now is not that there would not be capacity in the Suez Canal, it's through the Houthis shooting at the world, at the poor seafarers and so on, which is an outrageous situation, of course. So in terms of then also the type of cargo and ships, and linking this now to the food security also, and it's very, very simplified, but in terms of food, you can have bulk, you can have grain, maize, soybeans, corn in bulk. That's one type of trade. Or you have more processed food or reefer food that goes in containers. The impact, the biggest decline for the Suez Canal was actually on containers. And the Suez Canal situation has also had a bigger impact on container freight rates compared to the Panama Canal situation. The Panama Canal situation actually had a bigger impact on the Baltic Dry Index compared to the Suez Canal. So the grain prices were more impacted by the Panama Canal situation, the transport part of the grain price, while Suez had a bigger impact on the containerized price. So one really has to see what type of food am I talking about, and then there are different impacts by the different canal situation. I hope that's not too technical, but I find it interesting and important. You also mentioned of course, the Black Sea situation, and it is true, it has really very much improved. But in terms of food security, was an interesting lesson learned. So when the war in Ukraine started, food prices went up, especially the bulk, the grain prices. And half of the increase of the increased food price was due to higher transport costs. And that is for two reasons. First, say a country like Egypt now had to buy grain instead of from Ukraine, they have to buy it from Canada, US, or Brazil. So they have to pay for more days of shipping. That's obvious, like, okay, I have to pay more days of chartering ships to import my food. Now, the shipping market is very inelastic. There's a limited capacity of ships, not always, but at this moment, it takes 2, 3, maybe 4 years to build new ships. And if then the ships have to go longer distance because they now have to transport grain from further away, or they have to go longer distance because they have to go around South Africa instead of going through Suez, then the market price of ships goes up. So half of the increase of the food prices when the war in Ukraine started was due to higher shipping costs. And there again, it was due to more days of shipping, but also higher costs per day of shipping. I could go on and on, but I think that is hopefully not too technical response to your question.
Actually, I was looking at the challenges now.
Mm.
You know, we've got so many choke points and
Yeah.
the inflationary impact. What are you seeing now, particularly from a containerized standpoint? With the longer transits, the containers are also held up longer. So how does that moving forward? How's that going to impact food security now and for the future?
Right. No, thanks for that question. So during COVID, container rates went up, say, 5-fold. And this led to higher prices, prices of anything that goes into containers. And why did the price go up so much? Because ships spent more time in port during COVID. There was a lack of supply, so real capacity went down by 20%, or ships spent 20% longer in port. Currently, ships don't necessarily spend more time in port, with little congestion in Singapore, but now they spend more time on the longer distance, going through around South Africa. But the impact is the same. The real shipping capacity of container ships went down, and freight rates didn't go up 5-fold, only 3.5-fold. But again, the fundamental economics was the same. And this is really bad news. We realize, apart from our costs going up or down and the impact of Chokepoints, but we do see more and more volatility in this whole thing. And I think in the second round, when we discuss resilience, maybe we'll come back to this question. We really see more volatility now than 10, 20 years ago in this shipping market.
Thank you. You know, Dua, let's go. We're going into round 2 now, guys. And also, just friendly reminder to the panelists just to tighten up some of your answers if we can, so we can go through all these amazing questions. You know, Dua, the world is waiting for the WTO to deliver its next global agreement on food security. You've heard about the headwinds, the longer transits, the challenges of containers. Is it likely to happen in your view, and what is standing in the way when it comes to this global agreement?
Thank you very much, Lorianne, for the second question. More trade opening for agricultural and food trade is certainly needed. Agriculture is one of the most distorted sectors of world trade. Agricultural tariffs are as high now, on average, as industrial tariffs were in the 1950s, just to give you an order of magnitude. Subsidies in agriculture are only second to energy subsidies, to give you another order of magnitude. We absolutely need to open markets, and we need to make sure that trade policy doesn't act and doesn't become yet another choke point. Where countries sit on the map is no more than an accident of geography. We like to remind people of this in the WTO. There are some countries that cannot survive without international trade in food. So we really need to look at our planet as one. And we cannot be selfish about food. We have to share food. But also our food systems, Lorianne, are more integrated than most people realize, in particular for processed foods. People don't realize that a can of tomato paste has probably sourced ingredients from at least 3, 4, if not 5 countries before it's been produced. So our food systems are very integrated, and we must make sure, given that situation, that we don't hurt global supply chains. Now, trade opening is hard, and the reason why negotiations in the WTO are slow is because agricultural trade is looked at by governments through a variety of different prisms: national security, foreign policy, and industrial policy. On national security, I would say that there are competing narratives out there. Some would say that national security is better served by food being grown at home, or at least a large quantity of it. Others would say absolutely not. The world needs to become dependent on international trade and needs to make trade function so that food is produced where resources are allocated most efficiently, where there's water, where there's land, where there's energy. Both narratives have a grain of truth to them and will have to be reconciled. Foreign policy, we've seen the weaponization of food and conflicts. So governments do every now and then weaponize food. Industrial policy, we've seen governments use food trade, create an industrial policy for their agricultural sector and for food trade, wanting to outcompete trading partners behind a tariff or a subsidy wall. Now, we can't be naive about these things. All of these reasons are here to stay. All of these approaches and visions of agriculture are here to stay, but we will need to find a balance between them. Now, as we strive to find that balance, I would just like to remind the world that it took 50 years to build the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and it took 30 years to build the World Trade Organization. So the world has 80 years invested in its multilateral trading system, which is a public good. We have to make sure that our vision of the world and our vision and our perception of the dangers that we see everywhere today, whether in terms of pandemics or wars, do not become a self-fulfilling prophecy. We need to create a multilateral trading system in agriculture that is a force for peace and food security.
Thank you so much. I mean, there are so many moving parts, and as you know, the world is ever changing with the protectionist policies that we're seeing. So you guys have a headwind of your own, right? That's a choke point in and of itself. Ileana, let's talk about food prices and inflation as a result, right, of all these various headwinds that we're talking about. What is your outlook for grain and fertilizer prices from where you sit in Castrol? You're on mute again.
Yeah.
There you go.
Well, first I wanted to offer the support of the grain trading community to Doha and the WTO, because I think you expressed a lot of things there, and everyone wants to see a well-functioning WTO with a good dispute settlement body. I think it's important to remind that it's incredibly useful tool, or body, I should say. Now, food price inflation, we haven't, and I'll come back to what I said earlier, you know, we saw, and I'm looking here at grain prices, and I will say, you know, wheat, corn, and oilseeds, you know, they spiked, they settled down. We recently saw wheat coming down, losing the price of wheat coming down by 50 euros in the last 4 months. So we cannot say today that we have, there's not a problem of price of food linked to these choke points. I think what we need to look at and examine a little bit more is that, so we're looking here very much at commodities which are shipped, you know, in large quantities. We also look, of course, at food processed food, but commodities follow certain market trends. And soybean prices, for example, and I'll take an easy example here, soybean prices will spike, then they will come down. But when the soybean price has increased a lot, the feed manufacturer who is feeding his poultry has also sold his feed at a much higher price to the poultry producer. And so the poultry price at the supermarket will be much higher than it was. When the soybean price is going to come down, the price of the poultry is not going to come down. And I think this is really something that we tend to, you know, generally a little bit ignore, because we focus on markets and prices. So when we talk of food inflation, it's really also what happens at the retail level, because we see, all of us, that food inflation is there. We all do our shopping and see how food prices have increased. But in reality, this does not correspond to the evolution of the commodities, or I would say the staple, again, corn, wheat, and soybeans on the market. So I wanted to, so you also mentioned fertilizers, and we've seen more or less the same evolution with a spike of prices and then a reduction. If I look even at, potash, for example, Belarus is a huge producer and seller of potash on the world market. So there were lots of worries about that, but in reality, what happens, it sends its potash by rail now to China, and Canada has picked up the rest of the market. So same thing with ammonia. So really, we saw a stabilization, which doesn't mean they cannot peak tomorrow. And I think the situation with the Black Sea remains very, very, and I hear this from all the traders, very delicate, because we saw that there was at Odessa a vessel, a missile attack on a vessel in Odessa not so long ago. And this remains 90% of global trade goes by sea. So that remains incredibly important. We need a solution there in order not to go back to these spikes again, because next time you have a spike in the wheat price, for example, or soybeans, you have a knock-on effect on food inflation per se. And the last thing, yeah.
Oh, no, I was just going to say, most definitely when you look at the and so on effect, when it comes to food inflation, once the bar is set, and it doesn't matter where you are around the world, once prices go up, you rarely see the prices ever go down because they're built in.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
exactly. Ben, let's move over to about the insurance and the de-risking of international food, the trade in food. How much have you seen insurance premiums increase, and at what pace do you see them continuing to rise? Because as we all know, and as what Ileana pointed out, in the end, it's the consumer that's going to be bearing those costs.
Thank you. I would start by saying others, I'm sure, are much more expert on this. But from our experience in the Black Sea, well, let's start with the attack on the ship last week. So after almost a year of the new corridors guaranteed somewhat by Ukraine's unilateral action, this was probably the worst incident in international waters. It was the ship was significantly damaged, and it was a UAE managed ship delivering Ukrainian wheat to Egypt with Turkish investment interests as well. So there are a lot of players who could be upset and dismayed by this event. What's striking, though, we've talked to a lot of journalists and analysts and insurance people and diplomats. What's striking is that the bump in Chicago wheat price wasn't that great. At most, it was 2%, and there were other factors pushing that price. And we do not feel from our informal context that this is a game changer for the industry. So, and I think we've learned this, as some of my colleagues are veterans, some are newcomers, but we've learned that the shipping industry has a pretty thick skin for risk and for incidents that do not cause loss of life and do not cause a total loss of the vessel. There have been a number of ships who've been damaged, cargoes have been spoiled, and one or two seafarers have tragically lost their lives. But on the whole, the shipping industry keeps moving. Now, the insurance is an interesting story in the second chapter of the Black Sea in 23 to 24, because Ukraine wanted to encourage ships to try the new measures that they had introduced and to restart things. So the Lloyd's shipping insurance community in London were a little bit cautious, I think, about the restart, partly because the Russian Federation had boarded a ship in quite a dramatic fashion with helicopters. That didn't calm the horses. But what happened was a combination of two things. One was that the market will always find a price. And the more after ship number 1 made it through fine, and then ship number 10 made it through, the insurance premiums and the war risk and premiums were available and were coming down. But the other story was that Ukraine, with a London insurer, organized a public-private system whereby some of the risk would be guaranteed by the Ukrainian state. So if your ship was completely lost, a proportion of your claim would be funded by the Ukrainian taxpayer, and therefore your war risk premiums wouldn't be so high. And this took the edge off, and it de-risked to some extent, but also made it more affordable. And this is a model that's not completely new. It was used apparently off East Timor, it was used off the shores of Yemen as well. But the fact that Ukraine did all the legal mechanisms to make this convincing to the London market, I think did then, probably not that many companies used this model, but it made the commercial regular insurers think, okay, fine, we need to price accordingly. We can't let this new mechanism take all the business. So it also still has some gaps, because there's hull and machinery, there's the value of the cargo, and there's the P&I insurance, which affects like unexpected broad negative impacts. I want to make 2 more points. One is that the Russian shipping is now sometimes potentially uninsured, according to observers, because of its exclusion from some markets due to sanctions. So I think we have, and maybe Jan knows much more about this, I'm sure, but there is a peculiar backlash from Western sanctions, which is A, Western insurance are losing business, and B, there's a potential that some risks and liabilities are not properly insured. And then my final point, there are still uncertainties in the Black Sea. I think a more serious event where a ship sank and crew were killed would spook the markets. At the moment, we are told that the insurance price, the war risk element, is less than 1%, and that's now appropriately significantly less than the Red Sea. It's probably 0.5, 0.75, but they don't advertise their pricing, of course. And then a bit of a wild card, we are observing now that the safety of navigation is impacted potentially by widespread GPS interference. These ships are being spoofed. We worked with the University of Zurich. They estimated that 20% of the ships in the Black Sea were being spoofed to a fake destination, a fake location during the course of their journeys in the middle of this year. So this is, as you know, affecting aviation. And I have to wonder that the scale of spoofing in the Black Sea, as combined with the other risks, including sea mines, might be a new factor in terms of choke points and risk in future, and insurance pricing as well. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'm definitely going to hit on spoofing with Jan. And in regards to the attack last week, I actually flagged it to CNBC because it is significant. Unfortunately, as we all know here, when it comes to these choke points, be it what's going on in the Red Sea, the Black Sea, it becomes noise in the everyday world, whereas it's a very real challenge for the world of trade and logistics to navigate. Unfortunately, it becomes status quo. And, Sylvia, let's turn in terms of with the drought. I mean, I covered the drought extensively, spoke with Dr. Vasquez quite often. Did the drought impact food security at all? I know we touched on that earlier. And then also, too, we saw these creative ways. Trade's like water, it flows. So we saw trade traversing the land across Panama and then being reloaded on vessels. What do you see in terms of that resiliency and in terms of how the drought impacted the food security and, of course, the flow of food?
Well, I have to say that Panama is an important partner for all U.S. agricultural exports. And under normal circumstances, we manage around 20% of grain coming from the U.S. and going into Asia, mostly for feedstock for animals, but it is an important part of the whole supply chain. With the drought, what we saw, we didn't see really transshipment or movements in our intermodal system for moving this type of food that is mainly on board of dry bulkers. What we saw was a diversion, huge diversion via the Cape of Good Hope. And mostly also we have seen a change in trading patterns for South American producers in Peru, Chile, Ecuador, that many of their agricultural products are being containerized and moved to Asian markets. And that has been a growing trend in the past few years. So we have seen, it's like the Jurassic Park movie that they say life will find a way. Well, I think trade will find a way, and it has. And as Jan was mentioning, it makes it more expensive, obviously, because they have to navigate probably 11 to 15 more days to go around the Cape of Good Hope. And that reduces the supply of vessels. It increases the ton mile, and it's a burden on pricing as well. So I think, yes, it increases transportation costs, but it's an inelastic product and it will find a way to the market any way it can.
Most definitely. And Jan, let's talk about that. You know, with resiliency, resilient equals cost. You want to be resilient, you want your product, you're going to have to pay a little bit more. And we're seeing that right now, right? With all the different creativities, the different vessel strings, all the different offerings. What can we do to make sure that trade stays resilient, but also, you know, what are the inflationary costs, if you will, for this resiliency?
Right. No, good question. I have three thoughts, and you asked what can we do, like who is we, no? And if I am an operator, a shipper, an exporter, importer, or shipping line or port, or all this, much easier said than done. We want to diversify. We want to depend on as many sources as possible, different modes of transport, different countries. And Doha also mentioned, of course, we do not want export restriction. Of course, we do not want any limitation. So this already is an important part, and some I find really fascinating research UNCTAD colleagues have done on the question of nearshoring vis-a-vis friendshoring. And without going into more detail, but there's no nearshoring. On the contrary, if anything, distances are going up. Yeah. For all types of different reasons. Distance are going, but there's some indicator of, if depends how you define a friend, but there's more friend shoring, and that also I could argue is part of the being more resilient. Second, so that is more for the operator, the first one. Second one, like governments, authorities, what can we do if we look at it from that perspective? And I think, again, thank you also to the WTO. We are a big fan of the trade station agreement. There are a lot of technical digital solutions that can make trade more transparent, more visible. There are new technologies available, the whole AIS system that makes forecasts much easier, transparency, trade information portals, all these things also help. And the third and last answer to your question, what can we do? If I look now at the international community and looking at long term, we just concluded an impact assessment of the biggest challenge for shipping over the next 25, 30 years, which is the energy transition. It's the decarbonization. So we looked at what does it mean, what are the implications, the impact, the economic impact of measures that reduce the emissions from shipping. Without going into all the details, there's no doubt that shipping costs will go up during the transition, whether we like it or not. And that doesn't mean we shouldn't do the transition, but costs will go up. And the impact on agricultural goods, very, very broad categories, is bigger than the average impact on other goods. That's bad news. And that means that we really must get this transition right. We need transparency. We need a stable environment, we need investors in the ports, the ship owners, the shipyards, the investment funds, the energy providers. They need to know what will be the future carbon price, future levy, future measure, so that we reduce the risk and reduce the negative impact, that we avoid the risk of underinvestment, which, and now we come back to the choke points, we have learned from this crisis that if there's a shortage of capacity because of not enough water in the canal, or ships going around South Africa, or the Black Sea crisis, all these, it's always, or COVID, there's always supply capacity of ships goes down, food supply suffers, prices go up. And learning from this, we should have a just and fair transition of the energy transition to have enough investment and in time.
Great. Now let's go to the questions from the audience. And panelists, if you could please keep your answers brief so I can get through all of these. This would be wonderful. Ben, we've got a viewer from Russia who says, according to Ukraine itself, the top 5 importers of Ukrainian wheat are Spain, Egypt, Indonesia, Turkey, and Romania. Is any Ukrainian wheat going to a low-income country?
I refer the viewer to the Statistical Bureau of Ukraine. There is a live dashboard from the sourced from customs data, but that doesn't give you the destinations. The UN statistics will give you destinations, but a year or two late. Before the war, before the full-scale invasion in 2022, we found a fairly low percentage of Ukrainian exports going to sub-Saharan Africa. During the Black Sea Grain Initiative, a similar low percentage went to low-income countries in Africa and elsewhere. I think it has always been a natural phenomenon, is that the poor countries don't have the resources to import a large proportion of Ukrainian food. So the answer is some food from Ukraine has always gone to low-income countries, and that has continued.
Okay, wonderful. Ileana, let's go to you. In terms of our question here, it's from Vietnam. The grain industry is one of the least digitalized industries, with a lot of transactions still being paper-based. Is Cosrol and the grain industry more broadly taking any measures to digitalize the grain trade? Ileana, you're on mute again.
Okay. I'm told I'm muted by the host, and I have to mute with permission from the host. So I think this is a very interesting question. We've been working on this in the context of the International Grain Trade Coalition, the IGTC. We've done also a pilot project. The challenge is that, because I mean, the more digitalized, the better. COVID was a good, launched a little bit the appetite for doing it, because we were faced with a situation where countries wanted to digitalize because they wanted to avoid the contact with paper. But it's still difficult because there's resistance in some importing countries, which is a mix of resources, people fearing job losses. So we're expecting from those whose cooperation we need to implement it, to do it whilst knowing that the job could disappear. So there's a challenge, but we're working on it as a global grain trade organization. Yeah.
Wonderful. Dua, let's go to you. So we have a viewer from Geneva who wrote in saying the WTO's public forum was held last week. What were the main messages that emerged on food systems and the current challenges in your view?
Great question. Thank you very much. So yes, the public forum is sort of an annual rendezvous in the WTO where all sorts of stakeholders come and tell us about their concerns and their visions for international trade. I would say that on agriculture and food systems, there was palpable concern about the health of the multilateral trading system as a whole and about its ability to deliver food security. Concern because of the dispute settlement function of the WTO, the appellate body stage of dispute settlement that has still not been resolved. A lot of players want the dispute settlement system to continue to be effective so that trade is not threatened, and so they have recourse through the WTO. So there was a lot of discussion about that. There was concern about nearshoring, the issue that Iliana mentioned earlier, nearshoring and what the impact of that would be on food security if countries only want to trade with friends or with like-minded, with other like-minded nations, then where does that leave us? And in general, concern about the need to finish the job that the WTO has started, agricultural reform, agricultural trade reform, which is very important because, as I mentioned, it's one of the most distorted sectors of international trade. There was also discussion about emerging issues in the future, so trade and sustainability, agricultural trade and sustainability, with issues like deforestation and carbon taxes, etc., on the table. And there was a discussion, of course, about trade and artificial intelligence and emerging technologies and how the WTO could seize these opportunities. So a whole range of issues, I would say.
Thank you. Sylvia, let's turn to you. We have a viewer from Panama. The Panama Canal is celebrating 8 years of expanded waterway, which could, as you know, increase depth limits and additional transit slots. These could actually help, right, the canal to accommodate larger vessels and heavier cargo. Tell us a little bit about that type of expansion.
Well, you mean the expansion of the Panama Canal with the third set of locks?
Yeah, they want to know about could increase depth limits. We already know the answer, but the viewer here would like a little bit more explainer. Could increase depth limits and additional transit slots allow the canal to accommodate larger vessels and heavier cargo. You've already been doing that, but this is from the viewer.
Well, definitely, the Panama Canal has expanded and it opened a new third of locks in 2016. It enables vessels that are 3 times the size of the Panamax vessels that we traditionally transited before. And we have additional draft from 39.5 feet to 50-foot draft, which means that vessels can actually double their carrying cargo capacity, enable larger vessels. And recently we had a record-breaking vessel, the Marie from MSC, a container vessel that carried more than 17,000 containers. And that is obviously a big change from the maximum that we could handle before of 5,500 TEUs.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Jan, we've got a viewer from the UK who wrote in. In your view, how will the environmental sustainability agenda impact the transportation of food? And is it likely to raise the price of food? And are air and maritime sectors able to keep up with these regulations that we're seeing?
Yeah, thanks. And if you don't mind, I would make a very quick additional comment to the question that Ben answered very correctly about like the destination of the Ukrainian grain. Of course, the grain largely can be substituted, so that's not really the question. The impact is always global. And if I may compare it here with our talking about choke points, when the Ever Given was stuck in the Suez Canal, the freight rate that increased most was the one between Shanghai and Santos, which does not go through Suez, because this very much interconnected market, and the same happens with grain markets. So on the particular question, the sustainability agenda, and yes, we should not cheat ourselves that there is some sort of trade-off, at least during the transition, that reducing emissions or reducing other negative externalities has a cost implication. And from the impact assessment we did, especially raw materials, commodities that are high volume and not so much value per ton, they tend to be more strongly affected by higher shipping costs. No, now in the very end, yeah, we could now start the whole discussion about what is more costly, having climate change or having less climate change, and instead having certain more shipping costs. If these increases are planned well and is transparent, and investors can foresee them, then this negative impact, which is there in the answer to the question from the UK, can be minimized. Yeah.
Thank you. Ben, we have a viewer from Poland who just wrote in. They would like to know, how is the EU dealing with the complaints of Poland and Hungary and other Eastern European countries about cheap Ukrainian grain being moved by rail through their territories? And also, does Ukraine have the necessary storage facilities to store its excess grain?
I'm going to pass on the question of cheap Ukrainian exports reaching Eastern Europe. It's been a political hot potato, and there have been disputes at the border. The European Union, I'm sure Ileana could explain better than me, there have been measures to limit how much Ukraine exports to Europe to protect European producers. So I acknowledge that it's been a part of the story in the background to the maritime transport, but the Black Sea Grain Initiative and the UN has almost no involvement in that case. Regarding the production from Ukraine going west towards Europe, it was one of the reasons why the maritime route was so important, because of these political ripples in Europe. It was helpful to have maritime exports going to the rest of the world rather than relying on the solidarity lanes and the land route. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Ileana, if there is anything that you want to answer to that prior question, that's great. But let me tell you also that the viewer from Kazakhstan who wrote in, how is Castrol ensuring that the movement of wheat across the globe does not contribute to global emissions? How is it addressing emissions from ships and from road transport?
Thank you. I'll just say a few words about Poland, the discussion there. I think it was a transition. I think we need to say that it was a transition, after the end of the Black Sea Initiative. It was a very political discussion. I mean, I don't want to go into political debate, but we need to address the fact that it was that. We also it is true that before the war, Ukraine exported less than 2% of its exports went to the EU, and it became 50% after the war. But at the same time, that meant that the EU exported to other countries, as you know. So, I mean, it was very well explained by Jan that it is a global situation, and certain measures were taken by the EU as a whole to diminish imports, reroute imports from Ukraine. But it was a very political situation, which was misrepresented, I think we should say. So, because what we also need to keep in mind is that the cost of the war is mostly carried by the Ukrainian farmers at the end of the day, So regarding emissions, so we're in the midst of this conversation at the moment, looking at the fact that Europe wants to become a net zero continent in 2050. And we need to look at what this is going to mean on logistics and transportation. Yes, and 55% reduction by 2030, which is tomorrow. So this is something on which we are working, but this is for the moment done very much individually by companies who are choosing the means of transport, the shipping companies, and so on. But this is very much on our agenda.
Yeah, and it's also very costly, as we all know. And Jan, we could probably dip into that in a little bit. Dua, let's talk about our viewer from India. They write to you, given the current logistical challenges in the world food trade, pandemic, wars, isn't it normal for countries to want to create food stockpiles? And if I could take it one step further, and what are the implications of the stockpiling?
Okay, that's a great question. Thank you to the viewer from India. And indeed, the issue of the public stock holding of food is a very big issue on the negotiating table of the WTO. It's a big topic in the agriculture negotiations. So first, let me just say that creating food stocks is a very costly exercise. So it's not easy to stock food in very large quantities and to keep that food safe from rotting, etc. So creating food stocks is a very complicated exercise, and in general, it's probably a measure of last resort. However, the WTO does give policy space for governments to build food stocks. The question of the sort of WTO compatibility of these stocks with WTO rules arises based on how the stocks are created and how they're disposed of, and whether in their creation and in their disposal, they are compatible with the WTO rule book. So there are rules to ensure that these stocks don't end up distorting trade. For example, to give you a theoretical example, if a country builds up a food stock that it's unable to consume, and to use that food, it decides to simply send it onto the international market, depressing the global price of food, including for its competitors. So that kind of an issue can become a problem. I think there is space in the WTO rulebook for food stocks, and indeed a number of developing countries want them and are engaging in the agriculture negotiations to create more space for them. But the issue is how to strike a balance between the need to create those stocks and the concerns of trading partners.
Yeah, I mean, it's, communication is so key when it comes to these affairs. Sylvia, let's talk about communication. Speaking of communication, we have a write-in from a viewer in Egypt, and they would like to know, do the Panama and Suez Canal authorities ever liaise? And are there any lessons in your view that one canal can learn from the other?
Well, I guess definitely there are things that we can share. And there have been approaches in the past to talk relevant canals. And there have been visits from the Suez Canal to Panama and visits from Panama to the Suez Canal. However, we do not collude or discuss these commercial topics, but we do share some information about operation activities that can make either canal more efficient. So there is obviously room for more discussions in that area. And in terms of learning opportunities, I think our operations are very different because the Panama Canal is a freshwater canal. So we have different needs to handle water than the sea level canal in Suez. But we do have, I think, issues, probably similar issues in terms of labor, training, sustainability, and lots of probably areas in which you can collaborate.
Jan, let's turn to you. We have a viewer from South Africa, and they would like to know, how could the liberalization of services trade in the WTO facilitate when it comes to the movement of food across the globe? And which services would you say are the most urgent in terms of the need of greater market opening?
Overall, maritime trade is already very liberalized. I mean, over the ocean, and the context of the choke points of the Houthis, we have said actually shooting at an international commercial ship is like shooting at the world, with the flag of, say, Panama and owner maybe a German dentist foundation, and the manager sits in Switzerland, and it's built in Korea, and so on and so forth. And above all, the seafarers are then from Philippines or India that are being shot at. So that international shipping is already quite liberalized. A bit of a hobby horse of me is the cabotage coastal shipping, which is still often restricted and limits the possibility to combine and link national or even regional connection and services with international ones. So sometimes you have inefficiencies and parallel shipping routes, which make it less efficient. That's in terms of the shipping itself. Then if the callers from South Africa, there's a lot of potential with the African continental free trade area to allow African businesses to invest in other African countries as port operators, as freight forwarders, as multimodal service providers and investors. No? So there's some potential, but also be aware that shipping is already quite liberalized.
Most definitely. You know, Ben, I would like to talk to you a little bit more about the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We know you're working hard on a part two. We've talked about the success. Trade flows regardless. It takes initiative, it takes creativity. When everyone's belly up to the bar right now, when it comes to these negotiations, there's a lot of emotions. What are some key things from a human component does you and your team offer, right, when it comes to trying to break down the human barrier, right? Because when we're talking about all these physical war type of headwinds, but when it comes down, it's also the people. And let's face it, trade is people. Trade is moved by people, it's created by people. What can you give us from that aspect? Because that's a challenge.
I mean, I think from the perspective of the United Nations, it's a rare beacon of hope that multilateral conversations can have results even in the middle of an extremely hot war. And the common purpose of global food security was a point on which both sides could agree. So I think there's something here that food is special. Food is an area in which you can seek agreement across the front line, not only in a sort of idealistic way, but also in a hard realpolitik way, because neither Ukraine nor Russia wants to make other countries hungrier and poorer. You know, there's a political advantage to keeping the food flowing, and I think that it would be fair to say is part of the calculus of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. Turkey also is influential as a go-between between North and South and East and West, and the African Union also reached out to the Russian Federation very early in the process. There are many different voices speaking for the public good here, the kind of global public good. Now, in its implementation, things definitely weren't particularly idealistic. You know, the parties had to push through and we had to help them push through the day-to-day implementation of this deal, and it was bumpy. So I would say it's a story about the worth of political mediation from a neutral and impartial partner. That could be partly credited to the UN, partly to the Republic of Turkey, also non-governmental back channels and mediation groups also helped us. But it also is something about food that is special. And perhaps there's a lesson here that we don't want food to become politicized, but food can unlock political benefits. And one of the reasons the Black Sea Grain Initiative was so popular was that people, observers, countries, political analysts thought that this might open the door to a new and a bigger conversation. If we could agree, we sat every day in the same room with Russian and Ukrainian delegations. And the hope remains, I think, that speaking about safety on the Black Sea and food on the table in the global majority countries is an excellent starting point for a bigger conversation about ending this war.
Thank you. You know, Jan, I want to turn to you just because trade, we all know trade is also, when it's expanded, it develops the middle class. And so, and then of course, the on effect is food consumption and things of that nature. Trade is imperative. And we are, as we all know from COVID, we are highly connected. And like how Dua explained, how many ingredients go into a can of sauce, right? It just shows you just how connected we are. You know, recognizing that agricultural products in international trade they're shipped in a variety of ways, right? Bulk, break bulk, containers. What's the relative importance of each type of shipment in your view? And then on top of that, what are the differences in terms of the choke points, right, that impact those critical methods in moving food? Oh, Jan, you're on mute.
Really interesting question. When the war in Ukraine started, along the other simulations, or not simulating, the calculations I shared with you earlier, we also found, and you mentioned the middle class, that actually middle income countries were more negatively affected directly than the poorest and the least developed countries. Because it's the middle income countries that actually import more raw soybeans, grain, maize, corn, while the poorest and smallest don't even have the capacity to process, and they import already processed canned food. In the end, they will also pay more for that processed food if the ingredients get more expensive, but the immediate impact in terms of how much do I import and employment that is generated during this food processing, it was actually the middle income countries. And in that sense, yes, the increase in container freight rates are more negative for the smallest and poorest, who already pay most. During COVID, we simulated, and that was afterwards confirmed by the International Monetary Fund, that global inflation went up by 1.5 percentage points due to higher container freight rates. And the SIDS, sorry, these are our acronyms, and we got the talking points not to use acronyms, small island developing states, their prices went up by 8%. And that's a lot, that's huge, and that's an average. You can imagine families 10, 20% having a real income reduction if container freight rates go up. While the bulk is more, it affects those who process the food and who import the raw materials. I could go on, but I think that's short and sweet enough for your good question.
You follow directions very well. Well, I would love to thank all of our panelists today, as well as you, the viewer, for taking the time to listen in on such important dialogue. I urge you to all tune in into the trade dialogues on food headed by DUA. I am Lorianne Larocco, and it's been an honor to moderate this panel. Have a wonderful day.
Goodbye.